Hello, I'm Dennis Lyons, the editor of the Daily Item, and this is another in our continuing array of conversations with candidates for public office as the 2020 November 3rd election approaches. Our guest today is David Rowe, the incumbent Republican from the 85th State House District. His opponent is Democratic candidate Katie Evans. Welcome to the Daily Item.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here, Dennis.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to start with a story that we kind of stripped across the top of the front page yesterday about there still being more than $1 billion in stimulus money waiting for distribution. And if I read it correctly, Senator Gorder, voicing the Republican side, thought it should be used to balance the budget. Others on the other side seem to think it should be gone out to various other, whether it's to help businesses or what have you. What's your view? You're an owner of a small business here. What's your view of how that stimulus money ought to be used?
Well, it's important to remember that stimulus money is not free money, which is a common term thrown around a lot. That is taxpayer dollars, money that you and me and people all across the 85th District have paid into either the state or federal government. So being a wise steward of those tax dollars is incredibly important to me. There's definitely a lot of different thought processes regarding how to spend that money. I know that Pennsylvania is now staring down a budget gap of $5.5 billion. With undoubtedly the budget gap will probably grow this year, and next year will probably be additional shortfalls as the fallout from the shutdowns continues. We look to spending that money in ways that are beneficial to constituents in a sustainable fashion. One of those things that we're looking towards is Representative Owlett's Back on Track legislation that would use some of that CARES money to provide $1,000 to each family per child to use for education options. As we look to a lot of education setups changing these days, as many more students are opting for either cyber school, charter school, or homeschool alternatives to public schooling, it's really important that we're able to put money directly into the hands of those parents because taxpayer dollars should fund students and not institutions. And so making sure that parents are able to afford the things that their students need as they enter this new era of education is really important. So that's one thing I would definitely support using some of that COVID money for, but also keeping a large portion of it for essentially a rainy day fund, which Pennsylvania had succeeded in building up a sizable rainy day fund in previous years. Unfortunately, with the fallout of COVID-19 and the governor's response, that has been spent entirely. So making sure we have taxpayer dollars set aside so that we can balance the budget without needing to raise taxes and increase the already onerous burden of taxation that exists on the people of the Commonwealth is incredibly important. So being a wise steward of those taxpayer dollars is the number one priority.
Okay, so obviously you've been very vocal in your criticism of the governor and the way he has handled this. I guess the most recent thing that came about was the just barely missed overriding Governor Wolf's veto of House Bill 2513. Without going into too much into the weeds, what should the governor do now? Now that we can't go into the past, what should the governor do now to help local businesses and restaurants?
Well, let me start off by saying that early on, nobody really knew what was going to happen, so I gave the governor a lot of credit initially for his county-by-county addressing of the COVID-19 issue. Pennsylvania is a very big state, very broad demographically speaking, lots of diversity and population densities, so a one-size-fits-all plan doesn't make any sense. So I did give Governor Wolf credit early on when nobody knew what was going to happen with his county-by-county process. Unfortunately, that did not remain the case for very long, and the governor started implementing his one-size-fits-all plan, which was unfortunately detrimental to many Pennsylvanians, and we now have over 3 million Pennsylvanians who have filed for unemployment. So looking forward now, we do have the data. Then we didn't, now we do. We have the data, we have the science, we have the facts that we need to make decisions going forward. And those facts very clearly point to the fact that those who are most susceptible to COVID-19, meaning seniors and those who are immunocompromised, are the ones where state resources should be directed to offer protection. Unfortunately, the governor seems more interested in waging war on Main Street to the benefit of Wall Street by bankrupting mom and pop businesses across Pennsylvania while ensuring that big box corporate entities are able to pick up an outsized amount of market share, which is going to have a drastic impact down the road, given the oversized contributions small businesses make, not just by providing jobs, but also by contributing to our communities. They're the ones who sponsor our soccer teams, and they're the ones who host fundraisers and charity events, and those are the entities that are going to suffer the most because of this. So the bill that we were trying to pass would not have eliminated any sort of safety restrictions. It wouldn't have been a free-for-all. Rather, the objective was to bring some sort of common sense level of guidelines, allowing businesses to implement CDC guidelines as they were able to, allowing them to operate in a manner that is both safe and profitable, rather than the governor's one-size-fits-all restriction, which has unfortunately led to 63% of restaurants, bars, clubs in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania declaring that they will not be able to be in business within the next 6 months if the governor's regulations don't change. That industry, the restaurant industry, provides over 500,000 jobs, billions of dollars in revenue, and has deep roots throughout the supply chain all the way down to our agricultural community, and is an essential part of Pennsylvania's economy. And it's going to be very disappointing if we lose 63% of those businesses, those essential community pillars, simply because the governor is more interested in preserving his political power than he is in actually taking meaningful action.
Should bars be open right now?
I think bars can definitely be open in a safe manner. I have
Safe
far more faith in our small business owners. If you visit a lot of local businesses, a lot of local bars, they are taking the right precautionary steps. And I think that it is important to enable them to make the decisions that they know is best for their patrons, rather than a top-down decision from Harrisburg. And at the end of the day, for the governor to deny these businesses the ability to be profitable and to pay their employees and to put food on the table for their children, not only is it unconstitutional, which it is, but it sort of demonstrates that lack of awareness of how a business needs to function and how it needs to operate. And I have the utmost faith in our small business owners that they know best how to take care of themselves and their customers.
So I'm just trying to picture, what does it look like at a bar? Not a restaurant, a bar, a pub.
It depends.
What does that look like?
Depends on the bar, depends on the pub. I would defer to the owners. I've talked to dozens of restaurant owners who have told me that they have taken the precautions that they're supposed to. They have reduced their capacities. They have removed tables or X'd them off. They have put up barriers, some of them at their bar. Some of them have moved tables away from the bar. They're upgrading their sanitation. All of their staff are wearing masks. And those are the sort of common sense approach that people can take. Unfortunately, the governor's rules seem far more arbitrary, where you have such things as you're not allowed to order alcohol without food, but that can only be until 11 p.m. when you're not allowed to have alcohol, but you can then have food. And these things don't make any sense. You can't sit at a bar, but you can sit at a table next to a bar. These are the sorts of things that don't make any sense, but are hurting our small businesses immensely. And all I'm advocating for is an approach that makes sense without having to bankrupt every 63% of the businesses in the state.
So what's next? I mean, you've got, obviously, the failure to override this veto happened just the other day. What's next? What do you do?
Well, as we go forward, it's going to be a matter, first of all, of are you speaking to the specifically the COVID mitigation efforts? So we in the General Assembly are going to continue to do what we can to demonstrate that we are willing to work towards meaningful legislation. Whether or not the governor is willing to work with us has yet to be seen. He has not been interested in that up till now. We find out his regulations and guidelines and how they change through press release. We get no consultation. We get no heads up. We get no advance notice. This last time when the governor revised his capacity limitations for restaurants from 50% back down to 25%, I found out because a number of people started calling me because an advocate for the restaurant industry in Harrisburg had received notice before the legislature had that the governor would be revising his capacity restrictions. And unfortunately, the governor waited until a day of the week where restaurants were just ramping up to reopen at 50%. They had purchased consumables and perishables. They had brought staff back only to be shut down again and to have thousands and thousands of dollars wasted on things that they invested to operate at 50% capacity, which was sort of just adding insult to injury for an already ailing industry.
So how has this affected your business, your CrossFit fit in this place. How has it affected you?
Well, we closed for 2 months. The 2 weeks to flatten the curve, which has now turned into over 200 days to flatten the curve. We did close for 2 months out of an abundance of caution. We have reopened now. We are maintaining all of the state's COVID-19 guidelines. We have our COVID safety officer on record. We have all of the placards posted. We already sanitized our facility every day, so meeting that regulation wasn't difficult since that's something we already did. But I think that, at least from my personal perspective, COVID-19 has certainly injured my small business, as it has many small businesses, given how many people in this area have lost their jobs. I can't tell you how many of my customers have come to me and said that, simply, affording a membership is not something they can do right now because of the fact that they've lost their job or their small business is failing. And as a local small business owner who recently opened his business stated to me, there's only really one group of people that are trying to bankrupt my business, and all I want to do is feed my family. So I don't think there's a small business in the area that hasn't been impacted negatively by COVID-19, and more accurately, the governor's response.
And now this is a federal matter, not a state matter, but do you think there should be another round of stimulus funding? There's been a lot of talk about the debate going on, whether this is going to happen pre-election, post-election. But early on when we had the original plan where people were getting this additional money from the federal government if they were unemployed, do you think that should happen again?
Well, the continual subsidization of the economy is not a sustainable plan. The government does, however, have a constitutional obligation to rectify wrongs on their part, to remedy situations such as where they have deprived people of profit or property. The government does have an obligation to rectify that situation. So if these shutdowns are going to continue, there are a number of people that I know that have not yet received a single unemployment check. There are people who have had to take out second mortgages on their houses just to pay their bills because the Department of Unemployment within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is failing to such a degree that we have Pennsylvanians, like I said, over 3 million that are already on unemployment, and hundreds of thousands of them have yet to receive a dime. So I certainly think that the far more sensible and long-term and sustainable alternative to continued stimulus money would to be moving to a more comprehensive, sustainable, holistic, and safe approach to making sure their economy can reopen. Because I can tell you right now, I have not talked to a single person that told me that they would rather have a stimulus check over just going back to work. People tell me they would rather work, they would rather have their business be profitable, they would rather have their employees paid, they would rather have their bills paid and their children fed. But unfortunately, given the unconstitutional restrictions of those, there unfortunately has to be that point where the federal government is obligated to step in and make up the difference.
Okay. Bill?
You sort of hit on I think I understood where you're going, the 200-day flattening of the curve. And I know the legislature has pushed back, and there's even a proposed constitutional amendment on limiting the emergency declaration extension. I think we're still in our third. I don't think we've hit a fourth extension yet. Can you sort of explain the thought process behind the legislature wanting to get in there and sort of, because it sounds like you guys want to seat at the table to make the decision on extending it. From what I read about it, you guys agree that the immediate emergency declaration, the 21-day window, fits, but anything beyond that, the legislature should be included. Can you sort of explain that, and then maybe same thing with the overreach you're seeing there as well?
Sure. Well, the intention of the emergency powers is such that the governor needs to be able to react quickly in the time of an emergency. It is not to give him absolute power indefinitely. So what the General Assembly is trying to do is to simply reassert our ability to speak on behalf of the people who have elected us in how these emergencies should be handled. Like I said, the governor was not meant to have these powers in perpetuity. Rather, they were meant to be there for that short window of time that it takes for the General Assembly to convene and then take meaningful action. And so this constitutional amendment would simply require any extension to come with legislative approval, which, if we're staring down an emergency situation, then of course the General Assembly will undoubtedly support continuing that emergency declaration. But what we've seen is a governor use his emergency powers to rule essentially by executive order with no legislative support or no legislative input, despite the fact that we are the ones who speak for the people. We are the ones who are the boots on the ground. We look to the number of crises, artificial crises that have been manufactured by the governor's response, and it demonstrates why we should have a seat at the table. For example, initially during the governor's shutdown, we had industries in the supply chain that were shuttered while other ones were able to be open, but other parts of the supply chain were shuttered. We have pallet companies that are allowed to be open, but lumber mills that are not. And I had to explain to one of the governor's legislative liaisons how pallets were manufactured and why you need lumber to manufacture them. We have lots of campgrounds in the area, specifically riverside campgrounds. And when the governor closed campgrounds to all people who did not have permanent structures, nevertheless, these campgrounds were permanent homes to many people. I had to explain to someone in the governor's office how a floodplain works and what the regulations were regarding permanent structures in a floodplain. And even though it was someone's permanent home, you couldn't have a permanent structure in the floodplain. And so we had people having to move their RVs and campers into Walmart parking lots where they're crowded together side by side, rather than having them, safely distanced in a campground with a power and water hookup. So these are the sorts of things that, if the legislature had been consulted on, we could have avoided these artificial crises. You look at the new homelessness problem that Governor Wolf created by shutting down closures in construction industries. We had people who were, right in that little window. They had just sold their home and they were just about to buy a new home, but now they couldn't. So they were forced to either spend dwindling resources on a hotel room or forced to live in a car or rent a van and sleep in the back. And these are all true stories that have happened in the 85th district alone, let alone across the whole state. We have people who were trying to finish construction on their home. I had a man whose children were staying with his parents out in Nebraska, and he couldn't bring the children there, and he couldn't get back to them, so he was separated from his children for months because he simply couldn't move into his house because he wasn't allowed to finish it. So these are the sorts of things that if the governor is willing to consult with the legislature on, could have easily been avoided. And that's why this constitutional amendment is so important, to make sure that the General Assembly does have a seat at the table. Because as it is currently written, it is easier to impeach a sitting governor than it is to end an emergency declaration. And I think that is certainly a testament to the fact that the intent of the law has been badly misconstrued by the Supreme Court.
Do you think we are still in an emergency situation right now?
I think there's absolutely a reason we need to address COVID, but in a manner that is safe. And so if the governor wants to maintain his emergency declaration, I know that there are reasons for doing that from a clerical perspective, but for him to do so simply to retain his essentially dictatorial powers, I think is a wild aberration of our Constitution.
Do you really think that's why he's doing it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you look at his willingness to, and as we now slip into election season, and we're seeing his willingness to order prepaid postage on all mail-in ballots, and his allies on the Supreme Court are willing to say you have to count ballots 3 days after, but prepaid postage doesn't get a canceled stamp, so you don't know when they were mailed. You can't prove that those ballots weren't mailed on or prior to Election Day. The Supreme Court is also willing to say, and has said, that a signature that is mismatched, if it, on the book it's one thing and what you sign is completely different, that's no longer justification either for requiring a provisional ballot to be cast or for not allowing an elector to vote. And so those are the sorts of things that now we're approaching. Those have nothing to do with addressing the COVID-19 virus, nothing to do whatsoever, and yet he is taking those unilateral actions under the guise of his emergency powers.
Okay, well, you can disagree with that, and you have every right to disagree with that. But I asked the question: do you really think he's intentionally trying to be a dictator?
I do. I believe that if he was not, then he would have returned any of our phone calls. He would have approached the General Assembly to work together. He would have wanted to work with us collaboratively on any of the pieces of legislation we put forward. But instead, what you see is the General Assembly acts and public opinion follows, whether it's the reopening of the construction industry or it's easing restrictions on closings or car dealerships or all these businesses. We take meaningful action. The governor vetoes it. And then within a couple of days, you normally see some sort of revised guidance from his office that does something along the lines of what we are doing, but allows him to sort of retain his power and take credit. If he was willing to work with us and he wasn't simply interested in retaining his power, why wouldn't he just have worked with us on signing those pieces of legislation, the effects of which he implemented himself just a few days after?
Okay, Rick?
We'll leave the dictatorship for the moment. Let's talk about workers and workers' rights, House Bill 2748, which would, as you know, would end the mandatory collection of union dues and freeing workers from paying union fees against their will. Could you explain the bill and where does it now stand?
So the bill has currently been referred to the Labor and Industry Committee. Given the fact that we are on our way out of this session, we have a 2-year session, and this one is wrapping up. It is unlikely that that bill will be moved out of committee this session, but I will definitely be reintroducing it next session. The intent of the bill is essentially just to protect the rights of workers. And let me preface that by saying this is in no way an attempt to eliminate unions or marginalize them. Unions have certainly served an important role, but rather this bill would protect workers' rights by enabling them to exercise their First Amendment rights without having to be intimidated. Currently, and according to the Janus v. AFSCME decision that was passed down by the United States Supreme Court, it is unconstitutional to require union membership in order to have employment. So if you go in and you're a teacher and you want to have a job at a school, they cannot tell you that your employment is contingent upon your membership. That does not, however, keep an individual from joining a union if they want to. And I know several people in this area, several people who are my supporters that join a union for whether it's the legal reasons or there's some other reason that they want to join a union, they have that right. But it is now declared unconstitutional to make it a requirement. So that's what my bill would do, would just essentially codify in state statute. At the end of the day, this is a housekeeping bill because it is just codifying in statute what the United States Supreme Court has already declared. The other parts of the bill would require unions to be recertified every 3 years. The reason behind that is most of the unions in Pennsylvania, the public sector unions, have not been recertified. In fact, less than 1% of teachers in Pennsylvania ever voted for their union. So what this would do is essentially improve the quality of representation by allowing workers to have a better say in who represents them.
Okay, off to another topic. In April, a bill you sponsored that you said the Bill of Rights for those being treated for mental illness, protecting the rights of Pennsylvanians receiving mental health care by declaring that persons in treatment have a right to be free from abuse, neglect, and exploitation. It passed the House. Why was that bill necessary?
So one of the first groups that actually came to me very early on, that was something I introduced right after I was sworn in, were patient advocate groups where we had instances of those exact instances, neglect and exploitation within mental care institutions. And so because the right to be free from those things, from neglect, abuse, and exploitation, were not codified in state statute, it had just simply become difficult for, based on essentially a technicality, for victims to hold the perpetrators accountable. And so this was a very simple change to essentially make sure that individuals with mental health issues had standing if they were abused in a care setting. And especially given the sharp uptick we have seen in drug abuse and suicides and domestic violence, mental health is particularly now a bigger issue more than ever because there is a direct correlate between unemployment rates and all of those things. For every percentage point uptick in unemployment, you do see a spike in suicides, drug overdoses, substance abuse, domestic violence, child abuse. And so ensuring that we have a strong codified statute to protect those with mental health issues was very important to me early on.
Okay, so basically you were, as you said, you were codifying something that wasn't a huge problem, but you just wanted to make sure that you dotted I's and crossed T's.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Has that moved through? Where does that stand now?
It's currently in the Senate. So it did pass the House unanimously. It's currently in the Senate. I'm not sure if they'll be moving it out before the session is over. That would be a question for Senator
So you
Gordon.
may have to
Would have to reintroduce it next
It
session.
seems like something that would have, I mean, you just said it passed unanimously, it would have broad support
Yeah.
to get through. I mean,
Yeah.
if you introduce this in April and we're sitting here in October, that's got to be a little frustrating.
As all things in Harrisburg, everything moves slow, and usually that's a good thing. Usually it's better than it is worse that things move slowly because a lot of things in government are stopping the bad more than doing the good. But unfortunately, it means that sometimes the good gets bogged down with the bad.
All right. Speaking of slow, broadband. Every candidate we've had in here the last month it's a priority for everybody. It's more of a priority than ever now. You know, we have more people doing telemedicine than ever. We've got more kids doing remote learning. We've got more people doing business remotely. What are you doing in Harrisburg, and what are you telling your constituents in Sawyer and Union counties about where it's going out there?
So when we look at the broadband issue, as you said, it's going to become more and more of a necessity than it was, even a year ago, as we talked about earlier, as more and more students approach remote learning ways of continuing their education. It's very important as we look to broadband and the expansion of it that it's done in a manner that is sustainable. And so I've I've already been working. I've met with county commissioners of both Union and Snyder counties. They have been coming up with very creative ways to use existing infrastructure of private entities and radio stations and using their towers. I know at least for Union County, they were looking to use a portion of the CARES Act funding that they got to sort of put some of those plans into practice. So I think maintaining a very good working relationship with all of our county commissioners as I've done so, as we pursue that, trying to find out what I can do for them in Harrisburg to help them realize those objectives, I think is really important. I've met with the stakeholders of the broadband entities as well, and one of the things that they are very concerned about, I wouldn't say necessarily concerned, but they want it to be noted that does need to be done sustainably. Because if we're looking to have government subsidization of broadband in perpetuity, that's going to become a very big burden for the taxpayers very quickly. So we need to make sure that the way that we introduce broadband and bring it to the rural communities is done in a way that is sustainable, both for the entities, the providers, that it's profitable for them to want to continue to offer that service, and also that it's affordable for the consumers.
Yeah, you talked about bringing in stakeholders and private entities. I mean, is that really a key to it, getting as many people bought in as you can?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if we're talking about these are the people that are going to be making the installations, we want them to be invested in it. If it's simply an opportunity, and we see this all too often in government, to simply cash out on a bunch of taxpayer subsidies and then leave the industry or the entity or the infrastructure high and dry, that is something that is going to be maybe a very short-term appeal, but long-term it will leave us essentially back where we started. So making sure we have buy-in from the stakeholders, making sure we have buy-in from local governments, making sure it's a system that works for everybody without having to be a indefinite burden on the taxpayers, just subsidize it to make it functional is very important.
You talk about sustainability of it. I mean, what does it look like? I mean, is it fiber optic? Is it wireless? Is it 5G or whatever is out there? I mean, do you have is there a grasp of what it's going to look like everywhere?
That's why I would bring in the stakeholders, because I would defer to them. I mean, they would definitely have a better concept of what would work for what areas, and it's probably not a one-size-fits-all plan. It'll probably be very unique, and that's why I specifically went out of my way to work on the local level with our county commissioners, because they'll know better what's going to work in our specific communities than a sort of one-size-fits-all program from Harrisburg that might work great in some places and not work well in others.
What sort of dialogue are you having with school districts? I mean, particularly, you have some fairly rural districts out there, rural areas of Mifflinburg and Selinsgrove and Midwest school districts. What's the dialogue like with the school officials?
I know it's very important to them. Obviously, it's an important issue to them. As far as our conversations regarding the actual implementation of them, that has been very minimal, since much of the implementation will have to happen either through the state or through the county level. So they're certainly very supportive of my efforts in this regard, but as far as the actual implementation of it, they're not as much involved.
Okay.
Okay. Feels like it was a million years ago, but there used to be a pre-COVID-19 era. I mean, there was probably a legislative agenda before that. And there's a bunch of stuff out there. One of the things that's gotten some attention over the course of time is the push by the governor and the lieutenant governor to legalize the recreational marijuana. Should Pennsylvania legalize the use of recreational marijuana?
I think we need to treat marijuana as we do any other controlled substance. It is something that certainly provides a medical use, and Pennsylvania has legalized medicinal marijuana, and it's important to treat it like...
Did you support that when it happened?
That was passed before I was in.
I know, but
Yeah.
Would you have supported it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. I realize that medical marijuana does serve an important role for individuals who suffer from myriad issues. And so I do think it is important, though, to treat it like any other controlled substance. We do know that excessive usage or abuse of marijuana, just like many other controlled substances, can potentially have detrimental effects. However, I do think it's also important to make sure that we are treating it in a similar fashion. And that's why actually just this past week, I did support an amendment that would treat marijuana like any other controlled substance in regards to DUIs. We have had instances in the 85th District where you say you have a veteran who has issues medical issues that requires the usage of medicinal marijuana, and that veteran might be out for a drive. Maybe he hasn't used his marijuana in the last week or so, but if he's pulled over for whatever reason and he tests positive for that, it counts as a DUI. Even if it was a week ago, the strain can stay in your system for up to 10 days. And so to treat that as an immediate DUI when there was no impairment isn't fair to our veterans, to those people who have health issues, who genuinely and legitimately need medical marijuana and were prescribed it by a medical individual. And so making sure that treating it the same way we would any sort of narcotics or any other prescription medication, if you are using it to the point of impairment or you are using it in a way that is not prescribed, then you will still be charged accordingly. But if you are using it the way it was prescribed and there is no impairment, then I wanted to make sure that we were not singling out those individuals who might specifically need that for medical purposes.
Okay, this sort of segues into something else then. What, if you're not supportive of legalizing recreational marijuana, what about the decriminalization of marijuana?
I do think that when we look to, especially the lead that we're getting from President Trump on the federal level, I know that's a federal issue, we can definitely approach that, the decriminalization, from the same level that we approach overarching criminal justice reform. I do think that several of the rulings and the sentencing that have been handed down are certainly heavy-handed in a lot of instances, specifically because in the instances of usage of medical marijuana, essentially there isn't a crime, rather it's the user. There is no victim as if in a robbery or a murder situation. So I do think that the decriminalization of it is perhaps something we need to address from a more holistic perspective of criminal justice reform. But again, I don't support the legalization of it recreationally. It needs to be treated like any other controlled substance.
Okay, Rick?
Let's talk about a group of people who are very important, who provide a very important service, and those are volunteer firemen. There is a bill about volunteer emergency responders for a tax credit program. Where does that bill currently stand? Is anything in the works directly for tax credits for volunteers?
I think you're referring to House Bill 1673.
1189.
1189, okay. I know there's a couple of ones out there. The House just recently passed House Bill 1673, which would also do that, would also offer the ability for counties and local school districts to offer tax.
Just this week, right?
Yes,
Employers,
just this week.
Employers, yeah.
And there's a lot of different, there are probably 5 or 6 bills that do the same thing, and different things depends on which ones move. But that is definitely one of those options I think is hugely important. Especially in rural Pennsylvania, our volunteer fire companies provide an immense service to the people that live here. And not only do they provide the services that are life-saving, but they also provide benefit to the community by being volunteers. The burden to taxpayers, if Pennsylvania had to switch entirely to a paid workforce, would be in the billions of dollars. So the benefit that our first responders, our volunteer first responders, play in the community is twofold. So allowing counties and school districts to offer tax credit incentives, whether it's on goods that they purchase for, say, you have to buy your own oxygen tank or something like that, allowing them to write that off is important. If you are required to leave from your job to go respond to a fire, allowing that job to then get a credit for that and paying you for your time so that you don't have to miss out on valuable employment opportunities to serve that critical function of being a volunteer firefighter. These are all things I support. One thing that House Bill 1673 also did was extended the timelines for fire departments to use grant monies. Currently, you have 12 months. It's essentially a use it or lose it type situation. So a lot of times these fire departments who work really hard to sort of build up their budget for a long term and they factor in depreciations, they might not need to purchase something for a couple of years, but they have the grant money now. So rather than purchasing something that could last a little longer, House Bill 1673 would allow them to sit on that money for up to 5 years and allow them to use it in a more appropriate manner rather than just trying to spend it because they have to. So these, I think, are some very common sense things we can do to help out our rural and volunteer fire companies.
A couple issues you've hit on, the ruralness of this area and the broadband and now the volunteer firefighters and things like that. As a what could be a second term, now you're a freshman representative down in Harrisburg. How do you stress to the people from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Scranton that this is important to the people in my district, that we have a million volunteer firefighters that are going out at 2 o'clock in the morning or they're leaving the job in the middle of the day, or broadband is just not in McClure? I mean, how do you make your point and get it across to those people that we need the funding here too.
So it's difficult, of course, because Pennsylvania is as I said earlier, a very broad, diverse Commonwealth. I know that there is a program to bring legislators into rural areas, and I don't know when the last time was a Philadelphia legislator came to this area, but I would be happy to welcome any member that represents an urban area to come to rural Pennsylvania and see how things work. I do recall a recent debate that happened regarding dirt and gravel roads, and a representative from Philadelphia didn't believe those still existed in Pennsylvania. And on the flip side, if a representative from Philadelphia invited me to come see what was important in their communities, I would be happy to go and hear that as well. So I think a meaningful dialogue and being able to have conversations in a civil manner is of immense importance to convey to people who might not be able to relate. An urban representative might not be able to relate to the issues that rural issues have, and vice versa. And being able to communicate that, I think, is immensely important, and to also be available and interested in visiting those areas. As I said, I'd be happy to visit Philadelphia, and I have been there several times, but I'd be happy to visit there officially. I'd be happy to host any urban legislator to come see what it's like in Union and Snyder counties.
Okay. Dennis?
When your opponent was in the other day, we were talking a little bit about funding for the schools in Pennsylvania. Do you feel that there are flaws in the current funding mechanism, and what would you change?
So it's worth noting, first of all, that Pennsylvania is in the top 10 as far as spending per student goes. So dispelling the myth that Pennsylvania schools are underfunded is really important, because, as I said, we are one of the top 10 spenders per student. We look to specifically the issue of property taxes. One of the reasons that those continue rising, first of all, from the aspect of unfunded mandates from the state level, so making sure that mandates that come down from the state level are funded and not leaving the burden on local school districts. We also have to look to sort of the local representation and ensuring that local tax dollars are spent by school boards in an appropriate manner. Constituents need to be making sure that they're holding their school board directors accountable for their funds the same way they hold their state elected officials accountable for those funds.
Well, obviously, a lot of the money that the school districts are putting out go to pensions. We've had conversations around this table a dozen times or more about the need for reform on that end. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the pension system in Pennsylvania is a massive liability. That's why I personally declined to enroll in the state pension, because I think it is an unsustainable model. We look at some of the options that the State House has looked to essentially stabilizing the retirement system. First of all, we have PSERS and SERS, the Pennsylvania school, the public school employees retirement system, and the state employees retirement system. And we see that SERS is functioning fairly well, that they are doing well, that their pension fund is healthy. We are seeing the opposite with PSERS, that it is not doing as well, that it is underfunded. And so we have been trying to take meaningful regulatory steps to make sure that the pension systems of both systems are healthy and well funded without needing constant infusions of taxpayer dollars. Unfortunately, we've received a serious amount of pushback from several of the government-run public sector unions on that regard, and so trying to push through that and ensure that we are able to do right by the Pennsylvania taxpayer over the protests of special interest groups, I think, is very important.
I believe there are some districts that are probably paying more to retired teachers than they are to current employed teachers. Okay, I'm sure we've had this discussion before, but you're going to refresh my memory for me. Your stance on increasing the minimum wage.
So I think that the biggest thing that you can say about minimum wage is the true minimum wage is zero, because that's what you make when you don't have a job. And the calls to increase the minimum wage statewide, again, is one of those one-size-fits-all ideas that might work well in an urban area, but would be devastating to a rural area where many of our local small businesses simply can't afford a $15 minimum wage like Tom Wolf is calling for. A minimum wage exists essentially and is a threat to our small businesses because the ability to create increasing payroll and better income for everyone, which is what we all want to see, is to get the government out of the way. We saw President Trump lead the way on that with his deregulation and his Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that gave us an economic boom, especially here in Pennsylvania, where incomes were rising faster than the rate of inflation. So people's payrolls were going up; they were getting paid more. The sheets in our district were hiring people from $12 to $15 to $17 an hour, depending on the situation. So by simply getting the government out of the way, you're able to create jobs and you're able to drive up wages. Once you have the government start stepping in and mandating these minimum wages, you're going to see jobs disappear. You're going to see costs rise, and you're going to see the opportunities for employment simply evaporate. A lot of teenagers in this community, myself, growing up, worked at places that perhaps paid less than minimum wage at the time and maybe still pay minimum wage today. But those employment opportunities were critical for developing budgetary skills and interpersonal skills and customer service skills and those sorts of things that set up teenagers to then be effective adults that can contribute in a workplace. And it would be a shame to lose those job opportunities and to see the mom and pop shops that employ them disappear because the state issued a minimum wage that was unrealistic for our area.
Well, what if there was a realistic increase? I mean, around the other states that you could drive to quickly here, including Maryland, including Ohio, in some states with Republican governors, you have seen a gradual increase. So it may have gone from, 7.25 to 8 or to 8.50 or something like that, and over maybe the course of 5 years or so. Do you see any value in something like that approach?
Well, again, the most effective way that you can create a competitive and increasing wage is to create a competitive marketplace and a competitive job market. Is the more that you interfere and try to create these fake thresholds, the more damage that's going to be done to the economy.
So you don't think there should be a minimum wage?
I don't think there should be. The way that the minimum wage that an individual should earn is the amount that an individual is willing to work for. And if an employer and an employee agree on a wage, the individual should be able to have that job. By mandating a minimum wage, we're actually removing the opportunity for businesses to hire people who would be happy to work for less than minimum wage if it meant putting their food on the table, especially in this day and age with Pennsylvania's sky-high unemployment rate relative to the rest of the nation. So if we want to drive wages up, increase wages, lower unemployment, we need to create a competitive marketplace, competitive job environment with lower taxes and less regulation.
Okay.
I have Joanne.
Okay, Joanne Troutman.
Joanne Troutman, can you hear us? Joanne Troutman from United Way is on. She's been on from the jump. Can you hear us, Joanne? Okay. Hang on, let me turn it up. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, David. Thanks for doing this.
Hey, Joanne, how are you?
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions. The first is, what do you feel the biggest social problem? What do you feel is the biggest social problem facing our community, and how do you feel the legislature is addressing it?
When you say social problem, do you mean like unemployment? Do you mean?
I mean, whatever you recognize as being an impediment to moving our community forward from a social services human perspective.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I would say it is without a doubt unemployment. The number of people who have called my office now numbering in the thousands who have been unable to receive their unemployment compensation, or maybe they applied for the pandemic unemployment assistance. Any of those things that they have been unable to receive, we are looking at unemployment that is through the roof, and that is unfortunately having the devastating social fallout of, as I referenced earlier, increases in substance abuse, suicide rates, domestic violence calls. All these sorts of things have a devastating correlation when it comes to rising unemployment. So if we want to be addressing those social issues, we need to be addressing the economic crisis that we are unfortunately facing here in the Commonwealth.
When you mentioned no minimum wage, I'm curious what you would say about those individuals who exist in our community who are not afforded with the opportunities necessarily to receive or pursue education and training opportunities in the same way others may be. What would you say to them? How do we address that issue?
Well, I think what I referenced earlier when it comes to the Back on Track program, that legislation that we are pushing forward, sponsored by Representative Clint Owlett, that would provide money directly to parents and students to be spent on the educational items and options that they need. Because as we are entering this new era of education, as many students are moving to a remote learning program, as people are reconsidering their higher education options, ensuring that students and parents have the resources that they need to meet their educational needs, I think is of immense importance.
Okay, Joanna?
Two social problems that United Way works on. Yeah, I have just two more quick questions. Two of the impediments, the greatest impediments that we hear about when it comes to seeking family sustaining wages when it comes to employment are lack of childcare and lack of public transportation. Both are significant challenges in our community. What would you say that the legislature could do about addressing issues?
Well, first of all, let's touch on public transportation. I've met with the county commissioners to discuss this issue as well. Unfortunately, in our area, it might not be simply economically feasible without massive taxpayer subsidization. So in speaking with the county commissioners, we have discussed this. It's an option that I know is on the table, but I do know that it is also not something that is necessarily sustainable in this current day and age. It doesn't mean that it's not necessarily going to be sustainable down the road, but it's a program that for right now is currently not feasible. When we look to, what was the second thing you brought up?
Childcare.
Childcare, thank you. The childcare approach, that is something that actually we have seen in this area. A number of the childcare entities have come to me telling me that it is simply not worth staying open, or it's not worth opening a new facility, or they might just be closing it all because of the difficulty that comes with all of the red tape associated with operating a childcare facility. We have a number of pieces of legislation that came up this past session that, while well-intended, created a whole new layer of bureaucratic red tape that makes it impossible for any sort of childcare institution to open, let alone be profitable and stay open. So if we want to improve access to childcare in this area, the way to do it is to make it simply easier for childcare facilities to operate and to open and get the government out of the way. Because as with all things, when the government steps in and try to help, they typically end up making things much, much worse, especially when it comes to small businesses.
Definitely talk offline about transport at some point. But my last question is, several weeks ago during the presidential debate, the president was offered the opportunity to denounce white supremacy. I would like to ask you or give you the opportunity to do the same right now.
Sure. So I think that President Trump has denounced it up to 17 or 18 times, and I would absolutely join him in doing so. I think it's a little bit absurd that it's a talking point for certain members of either the press or the public or the political professionals who would try to claim something that was said that wasn't said. You can look at screenshots of headlines or tweets, whether it's by CNN's Jim Acosta, who announced 2 years ago that Trump's denounced white supremacists, and then just a couple of weeks ago tweets that Trump has finally denounced white supremacists. It has clearly become nothing more than a fake news political talking point to infer that he hasn't. And I absolutely echo his sentiments in condemning white supremacists or any hate group like Antifa or any other group that would marginalize any person in the America.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, anybody else got anything else for Mr. Rowe? We're done. Thank you very much. We will leave it at that, and we appreciate you taking the time to come in and spend a few minutes with us.
Well, I thank you guys very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Take care.